had finally decided to let my parents move into our house, but Luke was less than supportive. Plus, with your inability to cook, it's incredibly inconvenient, he added, his words sharp and dismissive. And then, as if he had any right to, he asked me to leave. I couldn't believe it. He walked up to me with that smug smile of his, as though he'd just won some sort of victory. For a moment, I was speechless, overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of it all. But then, my anger quickly boiled over, and I snapped. I would never put my parents in our house without consulting you, but you've decided to house your relatives without my consent. My voice wavered with fury, and I added, and now you want to kick me out of my own home? Luke's arrogant behavior had always irritated me, but at that moment, it made me feel physically ill. I realized I couldn't continue living this way. His entitled attitude, acting as though he had more claim to our home than I did, even though he didn't contribute financially, had drained me. I'm Addison, a woman in my 40s, and I work hard to support our family while Luke stays home, taking care of the house. While I'm grateful for his efforts, his overbearing nature had become unbearable. His constant demands, like asking me to fetch ice cream late at night, had worn thin. When I refused, he would remind me of his position as a husband, as if that gave him some divine right to command me. His entitlement, based solely on his gender, made my blood boil. The thought of enduring his behavior on top of the stresses of my demanding job felt impossible. I'm really tired, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I've reached my breaking point. Luke, I can't keep living like this, I said, retreating to my room to escape the mounting tension. But instead of letting me rest, Luke followed me, demanding an explanation for my withdrawal. Why are you acting like this, Addison? You can't just shut me out, he snapped, his frustration rising as he tried to reassert control. Feeling utterly drained, I managed a weak smile and apologized, hoping he would see how worn out I was. I'm just so tired, please understand, I pleaded, but Luke's disappointment only seemed to grow. I apologized again and retreated to my room, defeated by his domineering presence. Each day, I endured his control, his relentless demands, until I hit my breaking point. I had developed a stress-induced fever, too weak to function, too ill to even take care of myself. When I told Luke I needed to rest, he dismissed me entirely, accusing me of making excuses. You're just being dramatic, Addison. You're fine, you can still do your chores, he scoffed, his words cutting through me like a knife. Alone in my room, feverish and broken, I lay in agony. All I wanted was a simple act of care, a cold compress, a soft word of comfort, but instead, I was left to suffer in silence, drowning in loneliness. Why was I the one being treated this way? What had I done to deserve this cruelty? I couldn't understand why things with Luke had to be this hard. The pain and exhaustion pushed me to tears. When my fever finally broke after 3 long days of rest, I was forced to return to work, my body and soul utterly depleted. My colleagues and bosses noticed my exhaustion, their concern genuine and heartfelt. Are you okay, Addison? You look drained, one of them asked, their empathy a stark contrast to Luke's indifference. Their kindness moved me to the brink of tears. I could feel myself approaching the edge emotionally, a voice inside screaming that I couldn't endure Luke any longer. Deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd reach my limit, but in that moment, overwhelmed by everything, I couldn't find the strength to face the situation, let alone consider life without him. My love for Luke had withered long ago, yet the complexity of our shared life kept me bound to him. Every day, I gave my all at work, only to come home and be tossed around by his demands. The cycle wore me down, physically and emotionally. Then one day, while I was seeking some peace in my room, Luke called for me. It had been so long since we had a serious conversation, and his odd excitement made me wary. Addison, we need to talk, he said, his voice unusually eager. As I sat down, expecting the typical conflict, Luke, with a new intensity, dropped a bombshell. I'm going to let my parents move in with us, he declared, and by the way, your inability to cook is incredibly inconvenient, he added coldly, his words hitting harder than I expected. But what came next was worse. I'm changing the ownership of the house to include my parents. I'm divorcing you, and I'm going to start a new family, he said flatly. This is final. Your objections won't change anything, he finished with finality. I couldn't process his words, my mind spinning. A wave of dizziness hit me. Why can't we all live together? I asked, my voice shaky. They would love to be close to me, he replied, his tone flat, completely unaffected by my distress. Addison, as the man of the house, this is my decision, he said, his arrogance and disregard for my feelings palpable. At that moment, I knew, I couldn't stay in this relationship any longer. It was suffocating. Luke chuckled dismissively. Your love for me blinds you. All I want is to take care of my family, he said with a smirk. I didn't have the strength to argue. I haven't loved you in a long time, I whispered. I've already fallen out of love with you, I added, the words cutting through me as much as they might have cut through him. All that's left is astonishment at your selfishness, and regret for not leaving sooner. Luke seemed to misunderstand my resolve, mistaking my hesitation for lingering affection. If you leave, you'll be alone. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I took a deep breath, clarifying my decision. I'll leave, I said. Luke froze, clearly shocked by my willingness to walk away from him. You won't survive without me, he muttered, trying to regain control. I've already fallen out of love with you, I repeated firmly. Letting go of what's not needed feels liberating. My words hung in the air, and Luke stood there, staring at me, lost. I nodded, thanked him for everything, and walked out of the house for the last time. Back at my parents' place, I explained everything. Their initial anger at Luke's actions softened when they saw I had a plan. With their unwavering support, I began the long journey of healing. The first step was the divorce. After sending the papers, Luke messaged me, unsure of what was happening. I explained my feelings one last time, and then, after a few days of silence, he faded from my life completely. I received the finalized divorce papers from Luke and wasted no time filling out my section before submitting them to the county office. It felt like a clean break. Luke and I were now complete strangers, no longer tied together by marriage or any shared responsibility. I no longer had to carry the weight of supporting the household as his wife. During the divorce proceedings, we split our assets. Luke took the house, something I'd seen as nothing but a burden from the start, and I was more than happy to relinquish it. Instead, I chose alimony, a decision that meant I'd no longer have to worry about financial dependence on him. Since Luke wasn't working, his parents covered the payments, but I suspected he was actively job hunting, no doubt planning to repay them once he secured a steady income. Still, reality has a way of throwing even the best-laid plans into chaos. A month passed since the divorce was finalized. I settled into my new home, relishing the peace and solitude. Just when I thought I could finally move on, I got a call from Luke. Irritation surged within me, but I knew ignoring him wouldn't make things easier. For the sake of my own future, I figured it was time to hear him out. What do you want after all this time? I answered, my patience already wearing thin. His pleading tone barely registered, and I urged him to get to the point. Please, I need your help, he begged, his voice tinged with desperation. I couldn't suppress a cynical laugh. I'd anticipated some kind of trouble, but his situation was more severe than I expected. What happened? You're going to have to tell me the details, I said, though a part of me already had a hunch about what was going on. I wanted him to spell it out for me. After a long pause, he began, fumbling over his words. I became the full owner of the house, and everything was fine for a month, but now I'm struggling to pay rent because I'm still unemployed. I thought my parents, who live on a pension, could help cover the cost, but the bill was way higher than I expected, around $1,800. They can't afford it, and now they're furious. They came to me, and I don't know what to do. That's why I'm calling you. I'm lost. Despite the frustration churning inside me, I felt a bitter satisfaction in hearing him face the consequences of his own decisions. His tone shifted as he blamed me for not warning him about the terms of the lease. I briefly acknowledged my part in not explaining things better but reminded him that his ignorance about the cost was his own fault. You treated me like an outsider and pushed me away, and now you're dealing with the fallout, I said firmly. His impertinent call caught me off guard, but I listened as he continued to plead for help, oblivious to my own emotions. I need your help, Addison. We can't keep going on like this. His voice grew urgent. It was clear they were feeling the pressure. I guessed the rent was overdue, and they were probably already behind. I remembered how strict the landholder had been about rent payments when I lived there, the kind of person who wouldn't hesitate to escalate things if the bill was missed. Luke knew this well, and I couldn't help but feel some measure of vindication. I don't have anyone else to turn to. You still care about me, right? Luke's words dripped with selfishness, as if our past marriage meant I was still obligated to help him. I wanted to tell him that my feelings for him had long since vanished, but I held back. Instead, I replied coolly, I'm sorry, but do I owe you anything? You were the one who walked away. Isn't it a bit convenient that you're coming to me for help now? Luke's voice became pleading, desperate for understanding. Please, don't be like this. I really can't do this without you. Whether you still love me or not doesn't matter. We were married once. Can't you help me just this once? No, I said firmly, my patience fraying. It's been a long time since I stopped loving you. You left me, and even before that, I was already done. My words were sharp, carrying the frustration and sorrow that had built up over years of trying to make things work. When I said that, I could hear the disappointment in Luke's voice, and it hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had endured his selfishness, his indifference, his disregard for my well-being, everything in the hope of salvaging our marriage. I'd put in the effort, but this was the result. It wasn't just that we had grown apart, it was that he had never truly seen me, never cared to protect me or cherish me. He had treated me like a servant, a means to an end. while I silently suffered. And now, he had the audacity to call me, asking for help as if he were the one wronged. His self-centeredness was suffocating. Please, help me, he begged again. What if we get married again? This time, we'll start fresh. I promise I'll never push you away again. I couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. Marry you? Are you serious? This mess is all you're doing. I've been trying for years to get through to you, to make you see me, to make you care, and now you want me to pretend none of that ever happened? You want me to go back to that life? I'd never do that. I'm not going back, no matter what, I said, my emotions boiling over. My voice cracked, and tears began to flow, mixing anger and sadness. There was silence on the other end. I couldn't bear it any longer. Goodbye, I said firmly, before hanging up. After that, Luke didn't call again. I blocked his number, not wanting to hear his voice ever again. Later, through mutual friends, I heard that Luke and his family had been evicted from their home. He tried to get my former in-laws to pay his rent, but they were furious, refusing to help him. That's not what we agreed on, they said. Luke had trouble finding a full-time job, so he was stuck working part-time just to get by. His parents, too, were struggling. They had to sell their house and were now living in a cramped, run-down apartment, 3 of them, all in the same place. As for me, I threw myself into my work. My boss even mentioned a potential promotion, something I'd worked hard for. It seemed I might be the first woman to become a manager at the company, and I earned respect from both my peers and juniors. Friends occasionally asked, "Are you going to marry again?" But after everything, the thought of marrying, or even dating, again didn't interest me. After the life I'd been forced to live, I couldn't bring myself to entertain the idea. Life was long, and there was no rush. At my age, many people lived happily without marriage, and if I could live my life without regret, that was enough. If I could live authentically, at my own pace, that was all I needed.